If you've ever been cut off mid-sentence by someone who swore they loved you, had your ideas dismissed like you were reading from a children's book while the whole room laughed along, then drop a comment right now and hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear is the kind of revenge story that doesn't end with tears. It ends with empires changing hands and billionaires learning what it feels like to be furniture in their own lives. Picture this. Fort Worth, Texas, a private steak dinner where money wears Italian suits and laughs too loud because investors are watching. And in that room sits a woman named Elise Rowen, wife of Blake Harrigan, one of those billionaires who treats boardrooms like kingdoms and marriages like branding exercises, and she's about to make the most dangerous mistake of her life. But before we get to the moment that changes everything, you need to understand how she ended up in that room in the first place, because this isn't just a story about a bad marriage or a cheating husband. This is about what happens when someone underestimates the quietest person in the room, and trust me, by the time we're done here, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about power, loyalty, and whether forgiveness is kindness or just another form of control. Let's rewind to where it all started, back in Austin, Texas, where Elise Rowen became Mrs. Blake Harrigan in a ceremony that looked like a fairy tale, but felt like signing a contract nobody let her read. She was an art history lover, the kind of woman who could spend hours in museums tracing the provenance of a single painting, understanding how objects move through time and whose hands shaped their value. But Blake saw that passion the way you might notice wallpaper. Pleasant enough in the background, nothing worth discussing over dinner. He was the loud one, the camera-ready billionaire who operated between Dallas boardrooms where oil money still talks and Manhattan penthouses where new money screams. And when he proposed, he made her a promise that sounded like salvation. You'll never have to worry again. What he meant was she'd never have to think again, never have to contribute again, never have to be anything more than the elegant wife who stood 3 steps behind him at charity galas while he worked the room like a campaign rally. The mansion in Austin was massive, all glass and steel, and spaces so large her footsteps echoed when she walked alone through hallways that felt more like hotel corridors than a home. And Blake was barely there anyway, always flying out to close another deal, always one phone call away from somewhere more important than wherever she was standing. The worst part wasn't even the loneliness, though that hollowed her out slowly, like water wearing down stone you don't notice eroding until there's nothing left but smoothness where something solid used to be. The worst part was how he made her feel stupid for caring about things that mattered to her, how he'd smile whenever she brought up an idea or asked about his business, that particular smile men give when they're humoring someone they've already dismissed, like she was a child showing him finger paintings and he was too polite to say they belonged on a refrigerator, not in a gallery. She'd try to talk about art authentication methods, about how museums tracked ownership to prevent fraud, and he'd nod while scrolling through his phone, making those little sounds that mean he stopped listening before she started speaking. And then he'd pivot to his actual concerns, his real world, the grown-up business of moving money and crushing competitors, talking right over her like she was background noise he'd learned to tune out. But here's where it gets worse, because at least in private, that dismissal was just between them, something she could rationalize away by telling herself he was stressed, that marriage was about seasons, that loyalty would eventually be rewarded with respect. Then he brought another woman into their world on purpose, and not just any woman, Kendra Sloan, who started as a company secretary but climbed fast by understanding exactly what Blake wanted, which was someone who made him feel important every time she laughed at his jokes or touched his arm during conversations. Kendra became a fixture, showing up in Miami when Blake had investor meetings, standing next to him in Los Angeles when he did press events, always dressed like she was auditioning for a reality show about people who mistake money for personality. And the worst part was how Blake paraded her around like she was an asset, like having a flashy woman on his arm proved something about his success. Elise would be at these events too, standing 3 steps behind like hired staff, watching her husband's mistress drape herself over him while photographers snapped pictures and gossip sites ran headlines about Blake Harrigan and Mystery Woman, that everyone knew wasn't a mystery at all. Elise kept telling herself it was temporary, that if she just stayed loyal, stayed quiet, stayed elegant and uncomplaining, eventually Blake would remember why he married her, would see that she was the steady one, the real one, not the flashy distraction who'd disappear the second his empire cracked. She told herself this for 3 years, watching her life become smaller and smaller until she was practically invisible even when she stood in the same room with him, and maybe she would have kept telling herself that forever, kept believing that silence was a strategy rather than surrender, except something happened that changed the entire game, something she discovered by accident that made her realize her marriage wasn't just broken. It was built on lies from the very beginning. She found it in a safety deposit box tied to her late family, the Rowens, who died when she was in her early 20s, A private plane collision outside Colorado that took her parents and her uncle in one terrible afternoon, leaving her with grief and a small trust fund that helped her get through graduate school but never seemed like anything significant. She hadn't thought about that old bank account in years, but she was consolidating finances, trying to organize the scraps of identity she still controlled. And when she went to close out the box, she found a sealed packet she'd never seen before, documents that had been sitting there gathering dust while her entire life unfolded in the wrong direction. The packet contained information about a portfolio, a hidden investment fund built by her uncle, Marcus Rowen, who everyone remembered as the ruthless one, the investor who didn't care about being liked as long as the numbers climbed, and apparently those numbers had been climbing quietly for decades, compounding through market cycles and strategic positions until the total made her hands shake when she read it. Enough money to buy buildings, not just dream about them, enough money to fund entire startups or destroy entire companies if you knew how to use leverage like a weapon. But that wasn't even the most shocking part, because hidden in those documents was something that turned her blood cold and made her read the same paragraph 5 times to make sure she wasn't hallucinating from stress. There was a transfer attempt, paperwork showing that someone had tried to redirect this inheritance years ago, right after her family died, filing claims that would have moved the money into accounts she didn't control, and the signature stamp on those documents wasn't random. It was a corporate notary stamp she recognized because she'd seen it on contracts around the house, the same stamp Blake's company used for official business. Someone connected to Blake Harrigan had tried to steal her family's money before she even knew it existed, which meant her entire marriage might have been built on more than just his ego and her loneliness. It might have been built on theft disguised as love, on a billionaire who saw her as an obstacle to money he wanted rather than a person worth respecting. That discovery was 3 weeks before the Fort Worth dinner. 3 weeks she spent moving through her life like an actress playing a role while her actual thoughts were spinning in completely different directions, wondering how deep the betrayal went, whether Blake knew, whether he'd married her specifically to control that inheritance or whether someone in his organization had acted alone, and either way, what it meant about every promise he'd ever made and every moment she'd spent believing. Loyalty mattered. She didn't confront him, didn't even hint that she knew, because something in her had shifted after reading those documents, something cold and calculating that recognized she was holding information that could crack his empire wide open if she used it correctly. And the smartest move wasn't to cry or demand explanations. It was to stay quiet, to keep being invisible, to let him keep underestimating her while she figured out exactly what game she was actually playing. Which brings us back to Fort Worth, that private steak dinner where contractors and potential partners gathered in a room designed to smell like old money even though most of the people there made their fortunes in the last 20 years. Everyone laughing too loudly because they knew their behavior was being evaluated, their loyalty measured against their usefulness. Kendra was there, of course, positioned at Blake's right hand like she'd earned the spot through competence rather than availability. And Elise was at the far end of the table, close enough to be included in photographs but far enough to be forgotten during actual conversations. Blake was holding court, talking about a new acquisition target, some clean energy company he planned to gut and flip, bragging about how he'd identified inefficiencies and planned to strip the assets within 18 months, turning their research into patents he could license while cutting their workforce to skeleton crews, and the table was nodding along because that's what you do when a billionaire describes destruction like it's innovation. That's when Kendra made her move, and looking back, Elise realized it was coordinated. A setup designed to humiliate her in front of witnesses who mattered, because Kendra turned to her with this sweet, supportive expression, the kind that looks generous on camera but feels like a trap in person, and said how wonderful it was that Elise had such interesting hobbies, how art history must be so fulfilling, and wouldn't it be amazing if they could find ways to incorporate culture into the company's branding, make them look more sophisticated to regulators and investors who cared about legacy. It was a performance, a way to position Elise as the decorative wife with cute ideas while Kendra played the savvy operator who understood real business. But here's the thing. Elise had actually been thinking about this, had spent years watching Blake's operations and seeing the vulnerabilities he ignored because he was too busy counting profits to notice the structural weaknesses underneath. So she spoke, carefully choosing her words, offering a genuine idea that could actually solve one of the company's biggest problems, which was that their supply chains were a mess, full of contracts with vendors nobody had properly vetted, creating audit nightmares and fraud vulnerabilities that would eventually attract federal attention. She suggested using museum-style provenance methods, the same systems art institutions used to track ownership and authenticity, creating transparent documentation chains that would make audits cleaner and make it much harder for anyone to hide illegal activity or stolen intellectual property within their operations. It was a smart idea, the kind of solution that combined her actual expertise with practical business needs, and for about 15 seconds, the table went quiet because a few people recognized she was offering something valuable, something that could save them millions in compliance costs down the road. Then Blake laughed, not a real laugh, but that dismissive chuckle men use when they want to cut someone down without looking like they're being cruel, and he said something that burned itself into her memory with perfect clarity. "Honey, I love that you have your little hobbies, I really do, but provenance tracking is for galleries and antique stores, not for grown-up deals where real money moves fast. Maybe stick to the museum tours and let the rest of us handle the business side." Okay. The table laughed because it was safer than being next, safer than standing up for the wife and risking the billionaire's displeasure, and Kendra touched Blake's arm with this theatrical sympathy. Like she felt so bad for poor Elise who just didn't understand how the adult world worked, and in that moment, something inside Elise died, or maybe something finally came alive, because she realized with absolute certainty that this marriage wasn't luxury. It was systematic erasure, a slow motion. Murder of everything she could have been if she'd never signed up to be decor in someone else's empire. She didn't argue, didn't defend her idea or try to explain why they were wrong to dismiss it, because she understood now that words wouldn't change anything, that Blake didn't see her as a partner worth listening to and never would, that she could have the smartest idea in the world and he'd still treat it like a child's drawing taped to a boardroom wall. Instead, she smiled, nodded like she'd been gently corrected by someone wiser, and went back to cutting her steak while the conversation moved on to topics that mattered, which meant topics where Blake's voice was the loudest. But inside, in the part of herself she'd learned to keep hidden, she made a decision that would change everything. She would never beg to be heard again, would never waste another breath trying to prove her worth to someone who'd already decided she had none, and more than that, she would make absolutely certain that Blake Harrigan learned what it felt like to be furniture in someone else's plan, to be dismissed and diminished until he understood that underestimating people is the most expensive mistake a billionaire can make. So here's my question for you, and I want you to really think about this before you answer in the comments. If you discovered that the person who promised to protect you had actually spent years trying to steal from you, and if that person humiliated you in front of everyone who mattered, would you walk away quietly with your dignity intact, or would you stay long enough to dismantle everything they built and make them watch while you did it? If you're still watching, smash that like button right now, because what you're about to witness is the kind of calculated revenge that takes years to execute, the kind where a woman everyone dismissed as decorative furniture transforms into a financial predator hunting the very billionaire who thought he owned her. And I promise you, by the time we reach the end of this act, you're going to be on the edge of your seat wondering if she's going to pull off the impossible or lose everything in the most public way imaginable. We left off with Elise Rowen making a decision at that Fort Worth dinner. That moment when her husband Blake Harrigan humiliated her in front of people who mattered, when she realized her marriage wasn't a partnership but a cage, and when she decided she would never beg to be heard again. But what happens next isn't tears or divorce papers or dramatic confrontations. What happens next is something far more dangerous, because Elise does something that most people never have the courage to do when they've been broken down for years. She starts building a second life in complete silence, right under the nose of the man who thinks he knows exactly who she is and what she's capable of. 3 days after that dinner, Elise walks into a coffee shop in downtown Austin, one of those places where freelancers pretend to work while actually scrolling through their phones, and she sits across from a man named Nolan Pierce who doesn't look like the kind of person who manages hundreds of millions in discrete wealth. But that's exactly the point, because the best financial operators are the ones nobody notices until money starts moving in directions that shouldn't be possible. Nolan specializes in what he calls strategic invisibility, which means helping people with complicated situations build power structures that don't show up in public records, that don't trigger reporting requirements, that operate through enough layers of separation that even forensic accountants have trouble tracing the connections. And when Elise explains what she wants to do, he doesn't laugh or tell her it's impossible. He leans back, studies her face for a long moment like he's calculating risk versus reward, and then he says the 6 words that change her entire trajectory. This will take time and precision. She tells him she has both. Tells him about the inheritance nobody knows she controls, about the documents suggesting someone tried to steal it, about the husband who treats her like furniture while planning his next empire expansion. And Nolan nods slowly because he's seen this pattern before, seen what happens when powerful men underestimate the people they've spent years diminishing. And he knows from experience that the most dangerous opponents are the ones who've been watching and learning. while everyone assumed they weren't paying attention. But here's where it gets interesting, because Elise isn't just hiring one person. She's building an entire shadow operation, a team that works like intelligence operatives rather than typical financial advisors, and every person she brings in is chosen for a specific reason that connects to her larger strategy. She needs lawyers, but not the kind who advertise on billboards or handle celebrity divorces. She needs the kind who operate out of Chicago, who specialize in corporate structures and regulatory compliance, who know how to build entities that look legitimate while serving purposes nobody can quite pin down until it's too late. She needs a compliance expert, someone who understands SEC regulations and reporting thresholds so well they can dance right up to every line without crossing it. And she finds that person in Northern Virginia, a former government auditor who left public service because she got tired of watching rich people exploit loopholes she wasn't allowed to close. And she needs crisis PR, not the kind that manages celebrity scandals or product recalls, but the kind that shapes narratives before they become public, that plants stories and redirects attention, that knows how to destroy someone's reputation so thoroughly they can't recover even if the accusations turn out to be false. And she finds that specialist in Seattle, a woman who used to work for political campaigns and learned that truth matters less than timing when you're trying to control what people believe. Now I want you to think about something and drop your answer in the comments, because this is where the story starts asking hard questions. If someone spent years making you feel worthless, would you be satisfied with just walking away? Or would you need them to understand exactly what they lost when they decided you didn't matter? Because that's what Elise is building toward, not just escape but reckoning, and the machinery she's assembling is designed to do more than protect her. It's designed to dismantle everything Blake has built while making him watch the collapse in real time. The company she creates is called Rowan Harbor Investments, a name that sounds stable and institutional, the kind of investment group that could be managing pension funds or endowments, nothing that would raise suspicion if it started appearing in stock transaction records. The structure is complicated on purpose, built through multiple LLCs registered in different states, each one holding pieces of the larger puzzle but none of them directly connected to Elise's name, because the moment Blake realizes his wife is operating a competing financial entity, the entire strategy collapses and she loses the only advantage she has, which is that nobody thinks she's capable of this kind of sophisticated operation. Nolan sets up relationships with different brokers across the country, small firms that handle niche clients, boutique operations that don't raise flags when they make moderate purchases, and through these channels, Rowan Harbor begins acquiring stock in a very specific target. A clean energy innovation company based in San Jose called Crestline Power Systems, and here's why that choice matters. It's not random, it's not emotional, it's strategic in a way that shows Elise has been studying Blake's operations far more carefully than anyone realized. Crestline Power Systems is exactly the kind of company Blake Harrigan loves to destroy, a firm built by engineers who actually care about solving problems rather than maximizing quarterly returns. A company that developed technology for keeping electricity running in small towns during storms, for making power grids more resilient when hurricanes or wildfires knock out traditional infrastructure, and instead of chasing unicorn valuations and Silicon Valley hype, they focused on steady contracts with rural utilities and municipal governments, building something real that actually helps communities rather than extracting value and moving on. Blake identified them 6 months ago as an acquisition target, not because he believes in their mission but because he sees assets he can strip, valuable patents he can license to bigger companies, contracts he can renegotiate at higher prices, and a workforce he can gut down to skeleton crews once he controls the board. He's planning a hostile takeover, accumulating his own position while trash-talking their management in investor calls, spreading rumors about inefficiency and missed opportunities, softening them up for the moment when he makes his move and forces a sale. And what makes this particularly vicious is that Blake doesn't need Crestline. He's already worth billions, already has more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He's doing this because he can, because destroying companies and rebuilding them in his image is how he proves he's the smartest person in any room. And if small towns lose reliable power infrastructure in the process, well, that's just the cost of progress in his mind. Elise sees all of this, understands that Blake is about to destroy something that actually matters, and she makes a calculation that transforms her motivation from personal revenge into something more complex. She's going to beat him by protecting what he wants to destroy, by building a position large enough to block his takeover while keeping her involvement invisible until the final moment. But here's the problem, the thing that makes the next 2 years absolute torture. She has to live her normal life at the same time, has to keep being the dismissed wife who stands 3 steps behind him at events, who nods along when he explains business concepts she already understands, who watches Kendra Sloan drape herself over him in Miami and Los Angeles while pretending she doesn't notice the photographers capturing every moment, and the cognitive dissonance of operating a sophisticated financial war while maintaining the facade of someone who doesn't understand grown-up deals is the kind of psychological pressure that would break most people. But Elise has spent years learning how to survive in spaces where she's not supposed to exist, and she uses that training now, compartmentalizing her life into the performance everyone sees and the reality nobody suspects. The stock acquisition happens slowly, deliberately, staying under every reporting threshold that would require public disclosure, because the moment Blake's team sees Rowan Harbor accumulating a position, they'll investigate, and the investigation will eventually trace back to her. So she has to move like water around rocks, finding paths that don't trigger alarms, buying small blocks through different brokers on different days, sometimes waiting weeks between purchases to avoid establishing patterns that algorithms might flag. It's exhausting work, not just the logistics but the emotional toll of knowing that one mistake, one careless move, one broker who talks to the wrong person over drinks, and the entire strategy explodes before she's ready, leaving her exposed and vulnerable with a husband who now knows she tried to outmaneuver him, which means there's no going back, no reconciliation, only the kind of divorce where lawyers fight over every asset while tabloids feast on the spectacle. And she'd lose not just the marriage but any chance of actually protecting Crestline or holding Blake accountable for trying to steal her inheritance. Now, if you're wondering how she keeps the secret while living in the same house with him, make sure you're subscribed because the psychological warfare of this double life is intense, and understanding how she manages it tells you everything you need to know about what betrayal does to a person when they decide to fight back instead of breaking down. See, Blake makes it easier than it should be because he's so convinced she's intellectually beneath him that he doesn't bother hiding his business operations around her, doesn't password protect his laptop when he works from home, doesn't think twice about taking calls on speaker while she's in the same room, because in his mind she's like furniture, present but not relevant, there but not processing, existing in his space but not actually participating in his world. So she listens, absorbs information about his takeover timeline, learns which investors he's courting and which board members at Crestline he thinks he can flip, understands his strategy from the inside while he explains it to other people, never realizing that the dismissed wife in the corner is building a counter-strategy that will eventually checkmate every move he's planning. The double life creates moments of almost unbearable tension, times when she's sitting across from him at breakfast in their Austin mansion, and he's complaining about some activist investor trying to block his Crestline acquisition, and she has to sip her coffee and make sympathetic sounds while knowing that she is that obstacle, that every frustration he's experiencing is because of moves she orchestrated 3 weeks ago through brokers in Boston and Atlanta. Or times when Kendra is at the house, sprawled on their couch like she owns it, talking about some new branding campaign while Blake laughs at her jokes, and Elise has to watch this performance while checking her phone for updates from Nolan about whether the latest stock purchase went through without triggering scrutiny, and the rage she feels isn't the hot, explosive kind that makes people scream or throw things. It's the cold, calculated kind that makes people dangerous, the kind that doesn't need validation or witnesses, that feeds on patience and grows stronger every time she's dismissed or ignored or treated like her presence doesn't matter. 2 years pass this way, 2 years of methodically building a position that grows from 3% to 7% to 12%, always staying just dispersed enough that Blake's team doesn't connect the dots, doesn't realize that multiple small investment groups are actually tentacles of the same operation, and during this time, Elise transforms in ways that have nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with how she sees herself. She stops waiting for Blake to notice her intelligence, stops hoping he'll suddenly recognize her worth, stops measuring her value by whether he includes her in conversations or treats her ideas seriously, because she's building something that doesn't require his approval, something that exists independent of his perception, and that shift changes her in fundamental ways that show up in tiny details. The way she holds herself at events, the way she makes eye contact with people Blake dismisses, the way she asks questions that sound simple but reveal she's been tracking details others missed. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn, because just when Elise's plan is working, just when she's accumulated enough position to potentially block Blake's takeover if she moves carefully, something happens that threatens to destroy everything she's built. Blake's team accuses Crestline Power Systems of stealing trade secrets, of using proprietary technology that supposedly belongs to one of Blake's subsidiary companies, and the accusation is coordinated and vicious, designed to crater Crestline's stock price and make the board panic into accepting Blake's takeover offer. The lawsuit gets filed in federal court, gets leaked to business press on the same day, and within hours, Crestline stock is dropping while investors scramble to distance themselves from what looks like potential fraud. And Elise is watching her entire strategy collapse in real time because if Crestline's reputation is destroyed, if they're forced to settle a massive lawsuit, the company she's been protecting becomes worthless, even if she controls enough stock to block Blake's takeover. But the attack gets worse, becomes personal in a way that shows Blake's team has somehow detected her involvement even if they don't fully understand it yet. Because Kendra Sloan starts spreading a rumor through her social media channels and her connections in business press. A quiet whisper campaign suggesting that someone close to Blake has been trading Crestline stock on inside information, that there's going to be an SEC investigation, that whoever's been accumulating this position is about to face serious legal consequences for securities fraud. Kendra never names Elise directly, keeps the accusation vague enough to avoid defamation liability, but she makes sure the rumor reaches the right ears, the investors and board members who matter, planting the idea that Rowan Harbor Investments isn't a legitimate fund but a criminal operation that needs to be investigated. And the timing is so precise, so coordinated with Blake's trade secret lawsuit, that Elise realizes this isn't random. They know she's been buying Crestline stock. They don't know it's her yet, but they've detected unusual accumulation patterns, and they're attacking from multiple angles to scare her into selling before they figure out who's behind the purchases. This is the moment, right here, where everything could fall apart, where 2 years of careful planning and psychological torture and financial maneuvering could collapse into nothing, leaving her exposed and legally vulnerable with a husband who now has ammunition to destroy her completely. And I want you to comment right now about what you would do in this situation. Would you cut your losses and walk away with at least some dignity intact, or would you double down, fight dirty, risk losing everything on the chance that you might actually win? Because that's the choice Elise faces in this midpoint of the story, and the decision she makes tells you whether this is a story about survival or about something darker, something more ruthless, something that asks whether revenge is justice or just another form of destruction that hurts everyone involved. Elise spends 72 hours barely sleeping, running scenarios with Nolan and her legal team, trying to figure out if there's any move that doesn't end in disaster, because the pressures are coming from every direction at once. Blake's lawsuit is forcing Crestline into defensive mode, where they might accept any buyout offer just to make the legal nightmare stop. Kendra's rumors are making other investors suspicious of Rowan Harbor, which means Elise's position could be investigated by actual regulators if the SEC decides the whispers are worth pursuing. And at home, Blake is triumphant, celebrating with calls to investors and board members while Elise stands in their kitchen listening to him describe victory like it's already happened. Like the destruction of this company that actually helps people is just another deal closed, another trophy earned, and she has to smile and nod while feeling her entire strategy crumbling around her because she didn't account for how ruthless he'd be when threatened, didn't fully appreciate that dismissing someone doesn't mean underestimating their capacity for violence when they think their empire is at risk. But then something clicks, something shifts in how Elise frames the situation, because she realizes that Blake's attack is actually confirmation that her strategy was working, that he wouldn't be fighting this hard if he wasn't genuinely threatened, which means she has more leverage than she thought, more power than she's been willing to acknowledge, and instead of retreating, instead of cutting losses and accepting defeat, she makes a decision that changes the entire trajectory of the war. She's going to fight dirty, going to stop playing by rules that only protect people who already have power, going to use every weapon in her arsenal, including the information she's been holding back about the attempted theft of her inheritance. Because if Blake wants to destroy her reputation with false accusations, she's going to destroy his reputation with documented proof of actual crimes. She tells Nolan to prepare the documents about the inheritance theft, tells her lawyers to build a case that traces the corporate notary stamp back to Blake's organization, tells her PR specialist to start mapping out how to release information for maximum damage, but not yet, not until the timing is absolutely perfect, because the key to winning this isn't just about having ammunition. It's about knowing exactly when to fire so the impact is devastating and irreversible. Meanwhile, she has to keep living her normal life, has to attend events with Blake where he's riding high on anticipated victory, where Kendra is more brazen than ever, touching his arm in front of investors, laughing at inside jokes while Elise stands nearby like hired staff, and the humiliation would be unbearable except she knows something they don't. The endgame is coming, and when it arrives, everyone who laughed at her, everyone who dismissed her, everyone who treated her like furniture in someone else's mansion, is going to understand that silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. The tension during this period is almost physical, like walking around with electricity running through her nervous system, because any moment could be the one where Blake's team figures out that his wife is behind Rowan Harbor, where the whole operation gets exposed before she's ready, where the SEC actually launches an investigation based on Kendra's rumors and Elise has to explain stock purchases that look suspicious even though they're technically legal. She starts having nightmares about courtrooms and depositions, about lawyers asking questions she can't answer without incriminating herself, about Blake's face when he realizes what she's been doing. Not the angry face but the satisfied one. The one that says he always knew she wasn't smart enough to pull this off. That confirms every dismissive thought he's ever had about her capabilities. But she keeps moving forward, keeps executing the plan even as the pressure builds because she's past the point of no return now, past the point where she could back out and pretend this was all a misunderstanding, a phase, a momentary rebellion that didn't mean anything. She's built an entire secret empire that exists specifically to destroy her husband's plans. And the only directions left are complete victory or total destruction, and honestly, she's not entirely sure which outcome she'd prefer, because both of them mean the marriage is over. Both of them mean walking away from the promise that she'd never have to worry again. Except now she understands that promise was always a trap, always a way of saying you'll never have to think again, never have to be anything again, never have to matter again. And she'd rather worry every day for the rest of her life than spend another minute being furniture in someone else's home. Then Blake announces the Manhattan Party, one of those massive events where billionaires gather to prove they're important, where investors fly in from Florida and the Midwest to see and be seen, where deals get made in corners and reputations get built or destroyed based on who talks to you and who doesn't. And Blake tells Elise that this is where he's going to announce his acquisition of Crestline, that the deal is essentially done, that he's already celebrating with key investors, and she needs to be there looking perfect because stability matters, because image matters, because having a loyal wife in the frame matters when you're telling the world that you've just conquered another company. And then he does something that crystallizes every horrible thing about their marriage into one moment. He tells her which jewelry to wear, not asks, not suggests, but tells her, specifying exact pieces from her collection that project the right message, that make her look wealthy but not threatening, elegant but not independent, present but not important. Because even her appearance is just another asset he's managing, another detail in the larger presentation of Blake Harrigan as the billionaire who has everything under control. Elise stands in their bedroom holding the jewelry he selected, diamonds and sapphires arranged in velvet boxes, beautiful pieces that cost more than most people earn in years, and she realizes this is the final test, the last decision point before everything either works or falls apart completely. She can wear what he picked, can show up and play the role one more time, can stand 3 steps behind him while he announces victory and everyone applauds his brilliance, can maintain the facade right up until the moment when she reveals that his victory is actually defeat and his brilliance is actually blindness to the woman who's been dismantling his empire in complete silence. Or she can do something different, something riskier, something that signals she's no longer following his instructions even before the real confrontation begins. And the choice she makes will determine not just what happens at the party but what kind of person she's become after 2 years of operating a shadow war against the man who swore he loved her. This is the darkest moment, the point where she's standing alone in her bedroom with jewelry she doesn't want to wear and a husband who doesn't see her as a person, and the plan she spent 2 years building feels fragile, feels like it could shatter from one wrong move or one unexpected complication. And I want you to think about whether you've ever stood at a moment like this, where the safe choice is to comply and keep your head down and hope things work out, but the dangerous choice is to risk everything on the belief that you deserve better, that you deserve to be seen, that you deserve to matter even if the people around you have decided you don't, because this is the moment that separates people who survive from people who transform, and Elise is about to make a choice that will determine which category she belongs in. She doesn't wear the jewelry Blake selected, doesn't follow his instructions about projecting stability and supporting his image, because she realizes that every time she's complied with what he wanted, every time she's made herself smaller to fit into his plans, she's reinforced the belief that she exists to serve his purposes rather than her own. So she makes a different choice, a choice that sounds small but carries enormous weight. She's going to wear her mother's heirloom pendant, a simple piece that has nothing to do with wealth or status and everything to do with family, with the Rowens who died in that Colorado plane crash, with the inheritance that someone connected to Blake tried to steal, with the identity she had before she became Mrs. Blake Harrigan and disappeared into someone else's story. The pendant is gold, understated, The kind of jewelry that doesn't scream for attention but draws the eye because it looks real in a room full of people wearing expensive things that feel like costumes. And when she puts it on, when she looks at herself in the mirror wearing a sleek dress that she chose and jewelry that means something to her rather than to Blake's image consultants, she sees someone she hasn't seen in years, a woman who takes up space instead of apologizing for existing. The party is at one of those Manhattan venues that exist specifically for billionaire gatherings, all glass walls and dramatic lighting, with a live orchestra playing background music while waiters circulate with champagne that costs more per bottle than most families spend on groceries in a month. And the guest list reads like a Fortune 500 directory mixed with political donors and media personalities who've made careers explaining why wealth inequality is actually fine. Blake is already there when Elise arrives, surrounded by investors and executives, riding high on the assumption that his Crestline acquisition is about to be announced, that this party will be remembered as the moment when Blake Harrigan proved once again that he can take whatever he wants and nobody can stop him. Elise walks in late, deliberately late, because arrivals matter at events like this. And she doesn't go straight to Blake's side like she's supposed to. Doesn't position herself as the loyal wife waiting to support him during his big moment. Instead, she walks into the crowd like she belongs there independent of him, like she's a person rather than an accessory. And people notice, people turn to look because she's carrying herself differently than she ever has at these events, and the mother's pendant catches light as she moves, drawing attention to something authentic in a room full of performance. She starts having conversations, real conversations, not the surface-level small talk that wives are supposed to make while husbands discuss business, but actual substantive discussions with bankers who know about Crestline, with rival founders who've been watching Blake's takeover attempt, with a respected female board chair from Boston named Margaret Chun who takes one look at Elise's face, notices the surname on her name tag, and goes suddenly very quiet in a way that suggests she knows something, recognizes something, understands something that makes this moment far more significant than a billionaire's wife showing up at a party. Margaret pulls Elise aside, keeps her voice low, asks a question that makes Elise's heart pound. "Are you related to Marcus Rowen, the investor who built the infrastructure portfolio in the 90s? And when Elise nods, when she confirms that Marcus was her uncle, Margaret's expression shifts from curious to calculating. And she says something that suggests people have been watching Rowan Harbor's accumulation far more carefully than Elise realized. "Then you should know that what your husband is about to announce isn't going to happen the way he thinks. And a lot of us are very curious to see what happens when he figures that out." This conversation, this moment of recognition from someone who actually sees her as a strategic player rather than decorative furniture. This is the signal that Elise's transformation is complete, that she's no longer the dismissed wife hoping for scraps of respect but an actual threat that serious people take seriously. And the validation feels better than any compliment Blake ever gave her, better than any promise he ever made, because it's based on what she's accomplished rather than who she married. So here's my final question for this act, and I need you to comment your answer because this is where the story asks whether transformation is worth the cost. When you finally get the power you've been denied, when you finally become the person you always could have been if someone hadn't spent years making you small, do you use that power to destroy the people who hurt you, or do you use it to prove that you were always more than they saw? And does that distinction even matter when the endgame arrives and someone has to lose? Before we get to the moment that brings everything crashing down, I need you to ask yourself one question and keep it in your mind as we watch this final act unfold. When someone who destroyed your confidence, who made you invisible in your own life, who treated you like furniture for years, finally stands in front of you broken and asking for mercy, what does true power look like? Does it look like walking away with your dignity intact, or does it look like making them live under the rules they once used to cage you? Hold that question because by the end of this story, you're going to have to decide what kind of justice you believe in, and I promise you the answer isn't as simple as you think it is right now. So here we are at the Manhattan party. Glass walls reflecting the lights of the city. Orchestra playing music that costs more than most people's monthly rent. And Blake Harrigan is standing near the stage, checking his phone, laughing with investors who've flown in from all over the country to witness what he thinks is his moment of triumph. The announcement that he's successfully acquired Crestline Power Systems and added another company to his empire of businesses he's gutted and rebuilt in his image. He's wearing a custom suit that probably cost $15,000. His confidence radiating in that particular way billionaires have when they believe the universe bends to their will. And he keeps glancing toward the entrance, annoyed that his wife showed up late wearing jewelry he didn't approve, but not worried about it because in his mind, Elise's background noise, A detail that doesn't matter in the larger story of Blake Harrigan conquering another market. What Blake doesn't know, what nobody in that room except a few key people understand, is that the next 10 minutes are going to rewrite his entire life, are going to take everything he thought was certain and turn it into ash. And the woman he's been dismissing for years is the architect of his destruction. Standing in the crowd wearing her mother's heirloom pendant and talking to Margaret Chun, the Boston board chair who just asked her a question that suggests people have been watching Rowen Harbor Investments far more carefully than Blake's team realized. Elise is calm, calmer than she's been in years, because she knows what's coming, has known for 3 days exactly how this night will end, and the waiting is almost over. The moment when she stops being invisible and starts being undeniable is seconds away, and she's ready for it in a way she couldn't have been when this journey started, back when she still believed loyalty mattered and silence would eventually be rewarded. The host takes the stage, one of those professional event coordinators who specializes in making billionaires feel important, and he starts the introduction talking about Blake's incredible track record, his vision for American innovation, his commitment to building companies that last, using all the language that sounds impressive but means nothing because everyone in the room knows Blake destroys more than he builds, extracts more than he creates, and the companies that last are the ones that survive him rather than the ones he improves. Blake walks up to the microphone, that signature smile on his face, and he starts talking about opportunity, about seeing potential where others see problems, about how Crestline Power Systems has great technology but poor management, and how under his leadership they'll finally reach their full potential, which is billionaire code for we're going to fire most of the staff and license the patents to bigger companies while small towns lose the infrastructure that actually kept their power on during storms. He's maybe 90 seconds into the speech, hitting his stride, getting to the part where he announces the acquisition terms, when the host's earpiece buzzes with something urgent, and you can see the moment when the host realizes something's wrong, when the smile freezes on his face and he touches Blake's arm in that apologetic way people do when they're about to interrupt something important, and Blake stops mid-sentence, annoyed, because this is his moment and nothing is supposed to interrupt it. Nothing is supposed to interfere with the narrative he's built about himself as the genius who always wins. The host whispers something that makes Blake's expression shift from annoyed to confused, and then the host makes an announcement that changes everything. Breaking news has just come through about the Crestline Power Systems acquisition, and rather than him explaining it, they're going to show the official statement on the screens behind the stage, because this is the kind of development that needs to be seen to be believed. The screens light up with a press release from Crestline's board of directors, and the first line is enough to make every investor in the room go silent. The board of Crestline Power Systems is pleased to announce that we have accepted a partnership agreement with Rowen Harbor Investments, a strategic investor group that has acquired a controlling 72% stake in our company through legitimate market purchases over the past 24 months, ensuring that our mission to serve communities with resilient power infrastructure will continue unchanged and independently managed. Blake is reading this, and you can see him trying to process what it means, trying to understand how someone else bought a controlling stake without his team detecting it, trying to figure out who Rowen Harbor Investments is and how they managed to outmaneuver him when he thought the acquisition was guaranteed, and the room is watching him have this realization in real time, watching the confident billionaire become someone who doesn't understand what just happened to his carefully planned victory. But the real shock, the moment that detonates like a bomb in the middle of the party, comes when the screens change to show the principal owner of Rowen Harbor Investments, because it's not some hedge fund manager or Silicon Valley legend. It's not a rival billionaire or a foreign investment group. It's a photograph of Elise Rowen Harrigan, Blake's own wife, the woman he's been dismissing for years as someone whose hobbies belong in galleries rather than boardrooms, and the caption under her photo reads, "Founder and Managing Partner, Rowen Harbor Investments." And suddenly every person in that room is doing the same mental calculation, trying to figure out how long she's been planning this, how she kept it secret, what it means that the wife everyone thought was decorative furniture just killed a billionaire's takeover attempt, and Blake is standing on the stage looking at his wife's photograph on a screen behind him like he's seeing a stranger, like the person he thought he knew never actually existed. Elise doesn't wait for him to process it, doesn't give him time to spin a narrative or control the response, because she walks up to the stage, takes the microphone from the frozen host, and when she speaks, her voice is calm and clear and absolutely certain, the voice of someone who knows exactly what they've done and why they did it. She says, "I didn't buy Crestline Power Systems to destroy it the way my husband planned to. I bought it to protect it, to ensure that the engineers who built technology that actually helps communities during storms don't lose their jobs to quarterly profit optimization, and to prove something that took me too long to understand. Being ignored doesn't mean being powerless. It just means the people dismissing you aren't paying attention to what you're actually capable of. The room is absolutely silent. People holding champagne glasses they've forgotten to drink from, and Blake is staring at her like he's never seen her before, which in a way he hasn't, because the woman on this stage isn't the dismissed wife who stood 3 steps behind him at events. She's someone who spent 2 years operating a financial war in complete silence while he thought she was too busy with her little hobbies to understand grown-up deals. Now here's where the story takes a turn that nobody sees coming. Not even Elise herself, because Kendra Sloan, who's been standing in the crowd looking increasingly panicked as she realizes her position as the favored mistress just evaporated along with Blake's victory, decides she needs to do something dramatic to save the situation, to prove her loyalty to Blake and maybe salvage whatever benefits she was expecting from being connected to his success. Kendra pushes her way toward the stage, her voice cutting through the silence, and she starts making accusations that are designed to destroy Elise's credibility. She claims Elise committed fraud, claims she used inside information from Blake's business to make illegal trades, claims she manipulated the market and violated securities laws, and she's saying all this in front of investors and reporters, making it sound urgent and scandalous and worthy of immediate investigation, trying to turn the narrative from Blake's failure into Elise's corruption, because if she can make people doubt the legitimacy of Rowan Harbor's stock purchases, maybe the whole deal falls apart and Blake gets another chance at the acquisition. For about 30 seconds it almost works because people start murmuring, investors start pulling out phones to text their lawyers, and Elise can feel the momentum shifting as doubt creeps into the room, as people start wondering if maybe this whole thing is fraudulent, if maybe the dismissed wife isn't a strategic genius but just a desperate woman who broke the law out of revenge. But here's what Kendra doesn't know, what Blake doesn't know, what nobody except Elise's shadow team knows. They've been preparing for exactly this moment, have been holding back the most devastating piece of information specifically for when someone tried to flip the narrative, and now Elise gives a small signal to Nolan Pierce, who's standing near the back of the room with a tablet, and he sends a command that makes every investor's phone in the room buzz simultaneously with an email, containing documents that nobody was supposed to see, documents that turn Kendra's accusations into a weapon that fires backward. The documents show the attempted theft of Elise's family inheritance, the paperwork from years ago when someone filed claims trying to redirect the portfolio Marcus Rowan built, trying to move that money into accounts controlled by entities connected to Blake Harrigan's corporate structure. And the digital signature trail is so clear, so undeniable, that within seconds people are reading and realizing that the real fraud isn't what Elise did. It's what was done to her before she even knew the inheritance existed. The documents show the corporate notary stamp, show the shell companies involved, show the timeline of when the attempts happened relative to when Elise married Blake, and suddenly the entire story looks different. Instead of a vindictive wife committing securities fraud, it looks like a woman who discovered her husband's organization tried to rob her family, and who spent 2 years building power to protect herself and punish the theft. The shift in the room is immediate and brutal because investors hate one thing more than losing money, and that's being associated with actual crimes that could bring regulatory attention. And if Blake's team was involved in trying to steal an inheritance through fraudulent paperwork, that's the kind of scandal that destroys companies and sends people to prison, and suddenly everybody who was standing near Blake is stepping away, putting physical distance between themselves and someone who's become toxic in the span of 30 seconds. Sponsors are canceling commitments, board members are resigning through text messages, and Kendra Sloan, who seconds ago was trying to save Blake's reputation, is heading for the exit because she's smart enough to know that being photographed next to him right now is career suicide. And the mistress who was draped on his arm in Miami and Los Angeles disappears the moment the lights get harsh, proving what Elise always suspected, that loyalty based on benefits evaporates when the benefits stop flowing. Blake is standing on the stage, and for the first time in his life, he's experiencing what it feels like to be dismissed, to be irrelevant, to have people look through him like he doesn't matter, and the expression on his face is something between shock and rage and confusion, because his entire identity is built on being the smartest person in every room, the one who sees opportunities others miss, the one who always wins, and right now he's losing in the most public way possible in front of everyone whose opinion matters for his business survival. He tries to speak, tries to explain or defend or pivot the narrative, but nobody's listening. Everyone's reading the documents on their phones or making calls to their legal teams or leaving the venue entirely because being photographed at Blake Harrigan's failed victory party is not where successful people want to be documented. Elise walks off the stage, and as she moves through the crowd, something remarkable happens. People make way for her, not because they're avoiding her but because they're respecting her, acknowledging that she just executed one of the most sophisticated financial maneuvers most of them have ever witnessed, and Margaret Chen intercepts her near the exit, says something that almost makes Elise smile. Your Uncle Marcus would have been proud. That was exactly his style, quiet accumulation, perfect timing, and making sure everyone underestimates you until it's too late for them to respond. It's validation. Elise didn't know she needed, confirmation that she's not crazy or vindictive or criminal, that she's simply someone who learned to fight back using the same rules that were being used against her, and that the business world respects power regardless of where it comes from as long as it's wielded effectively. The aftermath unfolds over the next several days, and watching it is like watching a building collapse in slow motion, floor by floor, until nothing remains of the structure that used to define the skyline. Blake's other business ventures start hemorrhaging investors and partners, because the documents Elise released raised questions about his entire organization, about who else might be involved in fraudulent activities, about whether working with Blake Harrigan means risking association with criminal investigations, and in the billionaire world, perception is reality. Suspicion is enough to destroy decades of relationship building. The hostile takeover of Crestline is officially dead, replaced by Elise's partnership agreement that keeps the company independent and mission-focused, and the engineers who were facing layoffs under Blake's plan are celebrating because they get to keep doing work that actually matters, keeping power on for small towns during storms instead of having their patents licensed to whoever pays the most. Kendra Sloan, the mistress who was so visible at every Blake Harrigan event, completely vanishes from public view, deletes her social media presence, and according to rumors that circulate through business gossip channels, she moves to somewhere in Europe where nobody knows her face or her connection to the scandal, because being known as the woman who stood by a billionaire until the moment he lost everything is not a resume line that opens doors. The people who laughed when Blake dismissed Elise's supply chain idea at that Fort Worth dinner are suddenly very quiet, very careful about what they say regarding the situation, because nobody wants to be remembered as the person who humiliated someone who turned out to be far more competent than they appeared. But here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn, where it asks the question I need you to really think about, because 4 days after the Manhattan party, after Blake has lost most of his investors and several of his board positions and is watching his empire crack apart piece by piece, he shows up at a coffee shop in Austin where Elise is meeting with Nolan Pierce to discuss the next phase of managing Crestline, and Blake looks different, not just tired but diminished, like someone who's been forced to confront that their entire self-image was built on other people's fear rather than on any actual foundation. And he asks if he can talk to Elise privately, and she's surprised to find that she's not angry anymore, not afraid, just curious about what someone says when they've lost everything to a person they spent years treating like furniture. They sit across from each other at a small table, and Blake doesn't try to make excuses or deny what his organization did, doesn't try to explain away the attempted theft of her inheritance or rationalize the years of dismissal and humiliation, and maybe that's growth or maybe it's just recognition that lies won't work on someone who has all the power now. But either way, he says something that sounds almost human. I need a professional lifeline. I can't rebuild without capital and without credibility, and you control both of those things now, so I'm asking what it would take for you to consider some kind of arrangement where I don't lose everything. It's not an apology, not exactly, but it's the closest thing to vulnerability she's ever heard from him, and in that moment, Elise has to make a choice that will define not just her future but who she is as a person now that she has power. She could walk away, could tell him that the marriage is over and his business problems are not her concern, could take her inheritance and her control of Crestline and build a completely new life that has nothing to do with Blake Harrigan or the years she spent being invisible in his mansion. And a lot of people would say that's the right choice, the healthy choice, the choice that lets her move forward without being entangled in his destruction. Or she could do something more complicated, something that would shock everyone who's been watching this story unfold. Something that raises questions about whether revenge is ever really satisfying or whether power just creates new versions of the same cages we thought we were escaping. Elise tells Blake she'll consider a merger, a business arrangement where his remaining assets and expertise get folded into a new structure under her control, where he comes back not as an equal partner but as a junior operator who reports to her, who implements her strategies, who finally understands what it feels like to have your ideas evaluated by someone who has final decision-making authority. And the terms she proposes are designed to be both a lifeline and a lesson. He gets to rebuild, but only by proving he can follow instead of lead, only by demonstrating that he's learned something from watching his empire collapse because he underestimated the woman he married. The business community reacts to this news with a mixture of shock and fascination, because some people see it as extraordinary forgiveness. A woman giving her husband a second chance despite everything he did, proof that mercy is possible even after betrayal. But other people, particularly those who understand power dynamics in corporate structures, see it differently. They see it as the most sophisticated form of control, a way of ensuring that Blake Harrigan spends the rest of his career living under the rules Elise creates, working in the cage he built for her, experiencing every single day what it feels like to be the person whose ideas get evaluated by someone else, whose contributions get approved or dismissed based on someone else's judgment, whose entire professional identity depends on staying in someone else's good graces. The merger goes through 3 months later, and the new company structure is fascinating to watch because it inverts everything that defined their marriage. Elise is CEO, Blake is Senior Vice President of Strategic Development, which sounds important but means he handles execution while she makes decisions, and every board meeting, every investor call, every strategic planning session is now a space where Blake has to present ideas to Elise and wait for her assessment, has to hear her feedback, and implement her corrections, has to experience the same dynamic he created in their marriage, except now he's the one being evaluated. He's the one whose hobbies might not belong in grown-up deals if she decides they don't. Some people who work with them say Blake seems genuinely changed, that he listens better now, that he actually considers other people's input instead of assuming he's always the smartest person in the room, and maybe that's real transformation, or maybe it's just survival instinct kicking in when someone realizes their entire future depends on not repeating the mistakes that destroyed their past. Other people say he's just biding his time, waiting for an opportunity to regain control, that a man like Blake Harrigan doesn't actually change, he just adapts his tactics, and eventually he'll try to flip the power dynamic back in his favor because being subordinate to his ex-wife is not a situation he can tolerate permanently. Elise herself seems ambiguous about what she's created, and in interviews with business publications, when reporters ask her why she gave Blake a second chance instead of walking away completely, her answers are carefully constructed to avoid revealing her actual motivations. Sometimes she talks about believing in redemption, about how people can grow from their failures if they're given structure and accountability. Sometimes she talks about the practical benefits of using his expertise without giving him enough power to damage anything important. And sometimes, in unguarded moments, she says things that suggest she's still figuring out whether this merger was forgiveness or revenge, whether giving someone a lifeline when they're drowning is kindness or just a way of controlling how and where they breathe. The art history lover who used to spend hours in museums studying provenance methods now runs a company that combines clean energy innovation with strategic investment, that protects technology that helps communities while generating returns that compound her family's wealth. And she's discovered she's actually good at this, not just competent but genuinely talented at seeing opportunities and building structures that last. And the validation comes not from Blake or from the marriage she escaped, but from watching Crestline expand its services to more rural towns, from seeing engineers develop better technology because they have stable funding and mission-aligned leadership, from knowing that her decision to fight back instead of walk away resulted in something that matters beyond her personal vindication. Blake lives in an apartment now, not the mansion they shared in Austin, because that got sold during the divorce proceedings that happened parallel to the merger negotiations, and every morning he drives to an office where his ex-wife's name is on the door he walks through, where his professional survival depends on executing her vision rather than imposing his own, where the people who used to defer to him now check with Elise before making final decisions, and whether that's punishment or opportunity depends entirely on whether he's capable of seeing it as a chance to become someone better than he was when he had all the power and used it to diminish everyone around him. Kendra Sloan never reappears in their story, becoming one of those people who exists in the before times, someone who mattered when Blake had power but disappeared the moment that power evaporated. And sometimes Elise thinks about Kendra and wonders if she understands what happened, if she recognizes that loyalty based on benefits rather than respect is just another transaction that ends when the payments stop, or if she's moved on to some other situation where being beautiful and agreeable feels like a strategy for security even though it never actually provides safety when circumstances change. The marriage itself is legally over, dissolved through proceedings that were surprisingly efficient once both parties agreed on terms. And Elise keeps her married name for business continuity but introduces herself as Elise Rowen in social settings, reclaiming the identity she had before she became Mrs. Blake Harrigan and disappeared into someone else's narrative. And the pendant her mother wore, the heirloom she wore to the Manhattan party, hangs in her office now as a reminder that family isn't just about who shares your blood, but about who shares your values and stands by you when circumstances turn dark. The question that haunts the ending of this story, the question I've been asking you to hold in your mind, is whether what Elise created is forgiveness or control, whether giving Blake a junior partnership is mercy or just a more sophisticated form of the cage he built for her. And the honest answer is that it's probably both, that human motivations are complex enough to contain contradictions, that you can simultaneously want someone to grow and want them to suffer, want to help and want to dominate, want justice and want revenge, and all those desires can coexist in the same decision without canceling each other out. Blake gets to rebuild his career, but only under terms that ensure he never forgets what it cost him to underestimate someone, and whether that's healthy or toxic depends on whether you believe accountability requires comfort or whether sometimes growth happens precisely because circumstances force you to experience what you inflicted on others. Elise gets control and vindication and proof that she was always more capable than Blake allowed her to be, but she also gets a permanent connection to someone who hurt her deeply, and whether that connection is empowering or imprisoning depends on whether running a company with your ex-husband as a subordinate feels like triumph or just a different kind of trap. The business thrives because Elise's leadership style prioritizes sustainability and stakeholder value over pure extraction, and Crestline expands its technology to more communities while maintaining profitability that satisfies investors who care about both returns and impact. And in board meetings, when Blake presents strategic development plans, Elise evaluates them fairly, approves the good ideas and rejects the problematic ones, and the dynamic between them is professional and functional, and probably healthier than their marriage ever was. But there's always this undercurrent of history, this awareness that every interaction carries weight from all the years when the power flowed the opposite direction. So now I'm going to ask you the question that matters most, the question that determines what you think about this entire story, and I need you to comment your honest answer because this is where we find out what kind of justice you believe in, what kind of world you think we should build, what kind of person you want to be when you finally get power after spending years being powerless. Was Elise right to offer Blake a junior partnership instead of walking away completely, or did she trap herself in a connection that will poison her success no matter how well the business performs? And more importantly, if you were in her position with all the leverage, all the control, all the power to decide someone's professional future after they spent years making you feel worthless, what would you do? Would you choose forgiveness? Would you choose revenge? Would you choose something in between that contains elements of both? Or would you recognize that maybe the real power isn't in deciding someone else's fate, but in building something so successful that their existence becomes irrelevant to your happiness? Think about that question, write your answer in the comments, and then do me a favor. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that being underestimated isn't a permanent condition, that silence can be strategy rather than surrender, that the person everyone dismisses might be the one orchestrating moves nobody sees coming until it's too late to respond. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we tell stories here about power and transformation and what happens when people decide they're done accepting the roles others assign to them. And hit that notification bell so you never miss the moment when someone who was told they didn't matter proves they were the most dangerous person in the room all along. Your engagement matters, your perspective matters, and I genuinely want to know whether you think Elise's ending is victory or just a more complicated version of the cage she was trying to escape. So comment right now, start the conversation, and let's figure out together what real power actually looks like when someone finally gets to use it on their own terms.